military elite is basically ruling the country through brute force. You have a Muslim political leader who even gestured at the possibility of exercising some kind of sovereign agency, stand up against the US empire, was something unpalatable to Washington, D.C. Qamar Javed Bajwa had a big problem with Imran Khan wearing shalwar kameez. Pakistan of the 60s and 50s were so much more progressive. They have actively, in fact, also clamped down on Palestine protests. This is part of a larger global secular violence. The more violent they get, the more popular he gets. There is very much a Kamalism at work here.
Pakistan is an enchanting country, fertile and vast, with a talented young population and, at least on paper, all of the ingredients of a regional powerhouse. But the country is experiencing a tumultuous time. Former Prime Minister Imran Khan languishes in prison, while the country's military leaders use every greater coercion to maintain the status quo. Pakistan's economy is faltering, and the brain drain of qualified professionals continues to leave the country, devastatingly affecting public services and businesses. To help us understand the sheer predicament many Pakistanis feel, we have Professor SherAli Tereen, who recently returned from the country to share with us his experience and understanding of the underlying power dynamics of the country. SherAli Tereen is the author of the award-winning Defending Muhammad in Modernity and the book Perilous Intimacies, Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire. He's currently a professor of religious studies at Franklin and Marshall College. Dr. SherAli Tereen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the Thinking Muslim podcast.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me, Jalal. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's lovely to have you with us, and alhamdulillah, I think there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Pakistan, its politics, its social and political condition, economic and political conditions. I think we've had many of our viewers who for some time have asked to have a show on Pakistan. So inshallah, we hope today to shed some light on what seems to be a country that is going through a very difficult time, a very difficult period. Now, I know that you've recently visited Pakistan, you've just returned back to the States. So I suppose the first place to start when we think about Pakistan's social and political condition is the case of Imran Khan, who languishes, subhanAllah, in prison. Can I ask a question? What accounts for his continued incarceration?
Yeah, I think in some ways, the way one can reflect on that question is that there is a certain degree of fear and anxiety about the kind of popular support that he wields at this point. And there is a real fear that if he were to come out of prison and mobilize people in the way that he has in the past, that the current political setup may well crumble. And if he returns to power, that might lead to all kinds of trouble for the political puppets and the military elite that is basically calling the shots. And the interesting irony in all of that is that Imran Khan, largely speaking, has been a pragmatist. So it is wholly possible that if he comes out and is given a chance at general elections in which most likely he will win by a thumping majority, it is wholly possible that he might go through a very pragmatic route by giving some kind of a general pardon. And I mean, he's not the kind of radical politician who really, I think, would be that interested in some kind of an overhaul of the political system in which the interference of the military elite in matters of politics is completely swept aside. He's in fact even said it, even when he was prime minister, and later, in fact, in the sort of 1.5 years from his removal to him being incarcerated, that this cannot be done overnight, that he is more of a pragmatist, that he is more of a gradualist. So the interesting irony is that someone who is more of a pragmatist and a gradualist, the kind of fear and anxiety around him among the political elite has reached this kind of a almost schizophrenic level that the current political setup is going out of its way in trying to keep him in and intensifying its brutality on its own people to make sure that he does not come back to power.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. One of the things that we should try to inculcate in our life is a reciprocation of Allah's blessings, recognizing the sunan of Allah. And one of the great sunans of Allah, the patterns of Allah in creation that we see in the Quran and through Hadith, is for us to care for orphans. So just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took care of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we should then extend that care to the orphans in the world today. And Baitulmaal is at the forefront of doing this. $64 a month, $768 a year, you can take care of an orphan in the Muslim world. Imagine how powerful that is. That orphan will come and bear witness for you in the hereafter that you provided food, shelter, water, care, and value in meaning in a world that has lost its meaning. I want to encourage you to support the work of Baitulmaal through this orphan sponsorship. $64 a month, $768 a year can really impact and change the world.
Yeah, I want to understand the causes behind his initial incarceration and his imprisonment. Um, there's of course the version that many of his supporters would strongly propose, and that's the version that America had a hand in his downfall. And they normally cite the case of Donald Wu and the cipher. How much do you buy the argument that there were external powers who played a hand in Pakistan's in Imran Khan's removal?
Well, I mean, there are different layers of this question of what led to his removal and the kind of power dynamics at work there. There is certainly a local dimension, which is that falling out with the Pakistani military for various reasons. But primarily, I think, or to a large extent, precisely because of the kind of foreign policy or this kind of focus that Imran Khan had towards some gesture of Pakistan's popular and political sovereignty in relation to US imperialism and US pressure in terms of things like giving it bases, for attacks on Afghanistan, or being more of a client state in relation to the war on terror, and Imran Khan's long-running position of Pakistan not being a client state of the US. That had, I think, a large role to play even in the internal feud between the military and Imran Khan, and them falling out of favor from each other. But there is, I think, a larger international context. It's difficult to pinpoint the proportionality of the influence or the exact sequence of who was involved at what point. But I don't think it is a coincidence that this person, Donald Lu, from the State Department, tells the sitting ambassador of Pakistan in Washington, D.C., Asad Majid, that either you remove this person or there will be grave consequences. And then just a few days later, this vote of no confidence comes, and all these allies begin to jump ship, and his government falls out of power. So I think there is certainly a international element to this, and the underlying, I think, for your podcast, I think the thing that really needs to be emphasized here is that behind that is this gesture that Imran Khan made of exercising the sovereignty of a Muslim nation state. When he said that, are we your slaves? This famous speech that he gave, are we your slaves? And people make the argument, no, that was just some kind of sloganeering, and he really, did not even have the capacity to stand up against the U.S. empire. But I think what is at work here is that you have a Muslim political leader who even gestured at the possibility of exercising some kind of sovereign agency by going to Russia and by saying that, we will buy wheat from Russia because that is more advantageous for my own country. So even that hint of sovereignty being exercised by a Muslim political leader was something unpalatable to Washington, D.C., and it did what it specializes in, which is intervening in global South nation states and causing absolute havoc, which is what has happened since April of 2022 when Imran Khan was removed from power. In the last 3 years, economically, politically, in terms of state violence, things have really, really gone south. So I think that is an element which perhaps is underemphasized in this whole question of what happened when, and who was really responsible. This big picture question, I think we often lose sight of. And one of the reasons for that is that one of the kind of most popular narratives that was presented in Western media, the BBC and other avenues, was precisely this whole narrative of that this really is a local case of a lover-beloved relationship that went awry between the military and Imran Khan. That as this BBC columnist Muhammad Hanif wrote a column, I think in May of 2023, that this was just a lover's spat. What that kind of a narrative does is that it does not allow one to even think about the larger ideological and political dynamics at work in this tussle, and turns it into some kind of a local issue which does not have any political ramifications beyond just the relationship between the military and Imran Khan. I think there are major political ramifications. This is part of a much larger global trend. If you compare the case of Imran Khan to Rashid Ghanouchi to Mursi before that, all very different case studies, all very different people. But there is a common thread that I think weaves these case studies together, and that common thread is the refusal of the American empire to tolerate any hint of Muslim political sovereignty, which we see in different ways in these different contexts. But I think that is the larger big picture kind of framework that one needs to analyze this in a fashion which is beyond just these kinds of superfluous accounts of an internal lover spat between the military and Imran Khan.
So that begs the question, what is the relationship between the army leadership on the one hand and the American empire on the other hand? What is the power dynamic between these two entities?
Well, I mean, for most of Pakistan's history, that power dynamic has been primarily as a vassal of the US state. The military has, for most of its Pakistan's history, a very trusted client of the American state. And since this is the Thinking Muslim podcast right on the eve of Ramadan, I'm not using stronger words than that, though those would be more appropriate for this military. But the military itself goes through this kind of schizophrenia. On the one hand, sometimes it draws on these Islamic symbols of Tipu Sultan and the bulwark of some kind of Islamic sovereignty, and they call the nuclear bomb some kind of an Islamic bomb. So they go in that route oftentimes. But then it also, of course, and more dependably so, goes to the route of we want to be trusted allies of the US, and this was seen, of course, most dramatically and most consequentially in terms of the US war on terror, where you have, Pervez Musharraf, the military dictator, is completely allying with the US, turning a blind eye towards all the drone attacks and the kind of killings that happened as a result of that, because that for him was good for the Pakistani currency. I mean, that was the kind of mindset that he followed, and he had this kind of a larger secular narrative of seeing himself as some kind of a Kemalist, and he very explicitly actually has expressed his admiration for Ataturk, where the whole idea was that we will ally with the West and we will, moderate and enlighten Islam and Muslims in Pakistan, and that is what the progress of the Pakistani society should depend on. So this really, I think, is an important point, because what it shows is that these events that have happened from 2022 onwards are part of a much larger continuum in relation precisely to what you mentioned, the relationship between the Pakistani military and the American state, which has gone through its ebbs and flows. But in this particular context, we see that Musharraf doctrine being employed in even more horrifically violent ways, whereby the previous military chief, Qamar Javed Bajwa, the one who preceded the current one, Asim Munir, has been on record at even having told the Americans, as a way to curry favor with them, that, I don't even like Chinese food, is what he told them at one point. Don't think of me as some kind of a China ally. Really, I am a true ally of yours. And in this case, what we see is people like Qamar Javed Bajwa. These are basically, I won't even use the word Westoxified for them, because they're not even authentic Westoxifieds. We might call them as wannabe Westoxifieds. So Qamar Javed Bajwa had a big problem with Imran Khan wearing shalwar kameez. He kept on, in his different interactions saying that the Pakistan of the 60s and 50s were so much more progressive and, so much more quote-unquote modern. So this very superficial, this intensely mediocre kind of vision of what is a progressive, westernized society coming together with an alliance which has some catastrophic consequences. So there is no question that in 2022 and prior to that, this guy, the army chief, was very much working in collaboration with the American state. And remember that the American state, of course, was being run by Joe Biden, that foreign policy genius that we call him, the guy who after the Iraq invasion had this great idea that let's divide up Iraq into the Kurds and the Sunnis and the Shias, as if this is some kind of a apple pie that you can slice into different pieces. And that's a kind of violent human who we saw, of course, in terms of the Gaza genocide of how he perpetrated that. So he was the one in power, and clearly, I think that underlying sort of Islamophobic contempt towards a Muslim political figure exercising any notion of agency was very much at the heart of what happened. So yes, there is this collaboration that is continuing. And the last thing I would say on that front, Jalal, is that that alliance currently, in terms of discourse and in terms of the power dynamics, is deeply connected to Gaza as well. So the current military elite, there is no question that they would not say that in public because, of course, Palestine is a very sensitive question in Pakistan still. But there is no question that, why is it that you don't find the Pakistani government making any kind of substantive critiques or even statements in relation to Palestine? Why is it that in cricket matches today in Pakistan, you're not allowed to take a Palestine flag into the stadium? This is the second largest Muslim country with apparently a nuclear bomb. And they have actively, in fact, also clamped down on Palestine protests, which primarily have been led by this political party, the Jamaat-e-Islami, and they have always been, brutally clamped down upon by the military elite through the local police, of course, but they're the ones calling the shots. And how is all this connected to the PTI, Imran Khan's party, and this current political scenario? The way it's connected is, and I'll give you one small example, and that will give you a sense of how it's connected. Last year, I've been told by my sources at this elite university in Pakistan, perhaps the most elite university in Lahore, called LUMS, the Lahore University of Management Sciences. So there, the students decided not to have an encampment because that would not, have been maybe feasible, but they wanted to do some Palestine solidarity marches, which were authorized by the university, and they were about to go on. And at that point, the trustees and the people who have power basically forbid those protests, primarily at the behest of the military elite, because they're very sort of sensitive about these kinds of protests at universities like LUMS. And the main reason why they were so anxious about it, because their anxiety is that what if these Palestine protests snowball into and mushroom into a larger protest about the exercise of popular will and popular sovereignty and turns into a PTI protest, a political party and its political solidarity, which has been heavily and intensely, clamped down upon by the military elite in the last 3 years or so. So that is the level of fear that they have. And that fear basically connects to certain larger desires and larger goals of the American empire. So that is how Gaza, the torture against PTI and Imran Khan, and the alliance between the American empire and the military elite connect with each other. This is part of a larger global secular violence, which then manifests in different ways in different theaters like Pakistan.
So that's very fascinating. The picture you paint is then one of a military junta that is able to exercise power at will and will sometimes exercise that power directly, like Musharraf, or on other occasions exercise power through civilian leadership. So how much autonomy do these civilian leaderships actually have in relation to the power of the military?
Almost none. And I think that's an excellent question, because that question allows me to give your viewers a better sense of the last 3 years and the kind of political scenario. I mean, I realize that a lot of the coverage in the last, especially 2 years, has been on Palestine and then Syria. But Pakistan is a really important case study which is connected to these theaters as well. So very briefly, I just want to give a quick summation which connects to your question. So what we have to realize is that currently the popular will of the people is completely at odds with the sovereignty of the state. So this is the underlying political problem at work in Pakistan today. And the best example of that kind of a gulf between popular sovereignty and state power and sovereignty are the elections that happened exactly a year ago on February 8th, 2024. Now, the context of those elections is this, that from April 2022 to February 2024, when Imran Khan was removed from power through this very controversial vote of no confidence in April 2022, in that time frame, PTI supporters or anyone seen to have any kind of solidarity with the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf Party, the Pakistan Justice Party, or with Imran Khan, has been brutally, tortured and in large numbers, and the kind of state violence is really horrific and mind-boggling. To just give you some examples, in 2023, February, in fact, a young autistic young boy, I think in his early 20s or so, who was a PTI supporter, was jailed and then sexually tortured and brutalized and murdered by the local Punjab police, but of course at the behest of the Pakistani military. Over 50 people have been killed, usually peaceful protesters. Most recently on November 26th, where you had peaceful protesters in Islamabad, and they were literally fired upon at point blank, in which it is estimated that 15 to 20 people were killed, mostly from the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, which is the majority Pathan province. So a lot of these were Pathan men. So just to give you a sense of the power imbalances within Pakistan as well. So you have this primarily, and of course I don't want to kind of accentuate some kind of ethno-nationalism here, but this is an important context of primarily, landed elite and Punjabi military elite firing shots at these Pathan protesters. In the lead up to the election, you could not even see a PTI flag in the public sphere. I remember I was in Lahore and different parts of Punjab in January of 2024, and you could not even see a picture of Imran Khan or of the PTI flag. Now, remember, this is a person who, in addition to being a politician, is really one of the major national stars in terms of cricket, in terms of philanthropy, whatever opinion you might have of him, but he's really perhaps the most well-known Pakistani, but you could not even see a poster or a picture of him in the public sphere. All supporters were again being brutalized. If anyone was seen with even a PTI flag, was being taken to the jail and in many cases beaten up and tortured. You had PTI political leaders whose political solidarities were being changed through brute power, through blackmail, by saying that we will pick up your kid or we will pick up your husband, wife, whatever. And oftentimes these were not just threats; these things were actually done as well. Businesses completely razed from the ground, and really the most kind of inhuman tactics of brutalization were used. For example, one senator of the PTI who's over 70 years old, because he critiqued the previous army chief, Qamar Javed Bajwa, in a tweet, the military basically literally went into, this is a sitting senator, went into his home, beat him up brutally in front of his grandchildren, and then locked him up. And he's actually still in prison. He was later again imprisoned. This is someone called Azam Swati. So these kinds of things were happening. And to put a cherry or whatever you might want to call it on this torrid cake, right before the election, the Supreme Court, which was then being run by this intensely biased Chief Justice, he basically decided that they will take away the election symbol of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the famous cricket bat. And this is in a country in which most people rely on these pictorial, representations of election symbols to know who they will vote for once they go into the polling booth. Despite all of that, and on election day, literally PTI people could not have come out and showed their solidarities. But despite all of that, on February 8th, by 10 p.m., 11 p.m. Pakistan Standard Time, the PTI was on course to win around 180 or so seats in the Assembly of 266. And the PMLN, Nawaz Sharif's party, which has been installed in power currently, won only 17 seats. And incredible stories, for example, this cancer survivor, a woman in her mid-70s, a cancer survivor called Yasmin Rashid, who's a gynecologist and a PTI political leader, she has been imprisoned now, I think, for almost 2 years. And from the prison cell, she managed to beat Nawaz Sharif. And the current Chief Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif's daughter, Maryam Nawaz, also badly lost her provincial assembly seat. So this was really an event of tectonic proportions. Despite all that the PTI and the Pakistani public had gone through, they went to the polls and they defied state power and brutality, and PTI came with a thumping majority. Now, what happened the next day is not just an electoral fraud, it is a major electoral robbery that happened. where they basically, the military, went into polling booths and sealed these, places where they were tabulating the votes and just fudged the whole results. And some incredibly clumsy things were done, in that whole process. For example, the number one was changed into nines in some polling booths and constituencies, just to, in the most childish fashion, bring in the PMLN and Bhutto's party, the Pakistan People's Party, into power. So that is the background of the current political setup, in that you have a political government which has been completely installed by the military. Now, the military has always intervened in Pakistani politics, in elections, but this kind of blatant, almost childish intervention, which is, seen, it is as, obvious as in broad daylight what happened on that day. What that did is two things. One is that it just exemplified this underlying chasm between popular sovereignty and state sovereignty. And what the good thing that it did was that it really made it very obvious that who actually has the mandate and who actually is being followed by the people, and that is Imran Khan and the PTI party. So currently, his popularity has soared to unprecedented levels. And the biggest irony in all of this, and I'll just close on that note, is that had Imran Khan not been removed in 2022, in all likelihood, when the elections would have happened in 2023, he most likely would have lost. Because that is the trend that you see in Pakistani politics, that oftentimes incumbents don't make it through. Usually there is enough kind of public resentment. And there was quite a bit on questions of inflation, other reasons, and so on. So by removing him from power and doing all this kind of brutal tactics to keep him out of power, his popularity keeps on soaring. And we can talk a bit more about my reading of why that might be the case. But now the situation is that he is incredibly popular, and the military elite is basically ruling the country through brute force. And the more popular he gets, the more force and violence they expend. So that is the underlying tension at work here, and the contradiction at work here, that the more violent they get, the more popular he gets. But this situation is not sustainable for too long. But currently, that is what is happening. So the current political elite have absolutely no political standing or legitimacy. They are installed puppets who have shown their true colors, by the way, the PMLN and PPP, that, when it comes to the question of, coming into ceremonial power, they don't really have any real powers at all. But even for ceremonial power, they're willing to basically act as puppets of the military elite. And that shows that, all these civil society activists and who used to extol the PPP and the PMLN during Imran Khan's government as some great champions of democracy and, civilian supremacy, these basically two parties are parties of rabid thugs who are very comfortable in selling their souls when it comes to even getting ceremonial power. So that is what the situation is right now.
So I want to pick up on the point you make about ceremonial power versus real power. And of course, the army is the power broker, the real power behind most civilian leaderships. I mean, how immune was Imran Khan to such a relationship? I mean, I note that when he did come to power, there was plenty of discussion, especially in the West, about how the army leadership was patronizing, was supporting his organization and PTI and supporting his rise to power, and also working against the other parties and diminishing their impact upon the electoral politics. And even in power, it just seemed to me, I remember one anecdote during the time of COVID when he wanted to, I can't remember the issue, but he wanted to institute a lockdown or whatever it may be. And the army leadership intervened and removed that policy area from his portfolio. So it just seemed to me that the army leadership was the power broker, maybe not as blatantly as you describe now, but very possibly at that time.
So I think when it comes to this whole question of Imran Khan's relationship to the military or the legitimacy of his own power when he was in power from 2018 to 2022, the problem with the analyses that circulate on this question is that, oftentimes, and this is true for Imran Khan as a figure as well, that it really, operates oftentimes on extremes from, hero worship on the one hand, or complete rabid caricatures and complete disproportional ambush on the other hand. And I think on this question, that is the case as well. So the kind of narrative that we oftentimes see, for example, in Western newspapers or even English newspapers in Pakistan and so on, is that Imran Khan was brought in by the military because at that time it had problems with Nawaz Sharif for various reasons, and the military is really the one who brought him into power, and Imran Khan was the military's puppet, just like the current political leaders are the military's puppet. So it's basically the same cycle is being repeated. There is nothing new about it, and we are just sort of changing actors here, but the dynamics are exactly the same. So I think this is perhaps the most pernicious kind of argument that can be made for a few different reasons. One is, I give you very small fragments of the kind of violence that has happened in Pakistan in the last couple of years. And we can go back to that topic in a moment as well. So that's one reason, that there is no comparison between the kind of violence that Imran Khan supporters, or even those who might be doubted or suspected of being his supporters. And in many cases, they actually were not even his supporters. And I can tell you some stories on that front as well. So just this degree of violence and suppression and brutality that we have seen in the last 3 years has no comparison with what might have happened to Nawaz Sharif supporters earlier on. So that's point number one. The second thing is that narrative basically works on the assumption that in 2018, Imran Khan was some very unpopular leader who was installed by the military into power, and if it was not for their help, he really did not have any kind of popularity. That is not true either. And a great example for showing that is the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, KP, where his government for the first time came into power in 2013 and made a government. And then when it came to the 2018 elections, not only did it come back into power, but with a thumping majority. The first government was a coalition government. So clearly there is something that he must have done to get that kind of a thumping majority. All of that could not be the work of the military. His political rallies and the kind of support he was drawing was in huge numbers. That could not just be the work of the military. So in some ways, what one can say is that Imran Khan, even in 2018, was popular, but not to the same degree as he is now. I think that would be perhaps a more kind of measured thing to say. And the other measured thing that one can say is that when it comes to the province of Punjab, there are people who, changed their loyalties and left Nawaz Sharif or became independent, and many of them joined Imran Khan because they saw that, this basically is a political actor most likely to come into power. And on that front, it is wholly possible and it is wholly reasonable that the military might have had a role to play in that, change of alliances and so on. And it is also true, and this is something even Imran Khan himself admits, that once he came into power, the coalition government on which his government depended did include many allies who were brought into Imran Khan's government as allies by the military. Now there are competing narratives on that front. So many people within PTI or people who are Imran Khan supporters argue that in 2018 elections, in fact on election night, it is PTI that the military worked against because at one point when the results were being announced, this software system called the RTS, I believe, went down, and then when the results started coming back later at night, there were quite a few PTI people who were winning and were later lost to PMLN leaders. So there are different narratives on that front, but it is, I think, true that the government was kept together by the military, and that is how they play this game, keeping people dependent on them. And it is also true, and I think this is a very important critique that one should make of Imran Khan, which is that when he was in power from 2018 to 2022, his party is called the Justice Party of Pakistan, but it really did absolutely nothing to address the injustice of the most intensive and the most nauseous agent of injustice in Pakistan, and the most powerful agent of injustice in Pakistan, and that is a military elite, and that he was quite comfortable on being on the same page, as he used to call it. And for that, he should absolutely be critiqued, and absolutely be critiqued very severely. So he basically went for that pragmatic route of staying in power, going after the quote-unquote corrupt political elite. In many cases, they are corrupt. Some of them, of course, had joined his party as well. So the point here is that, there is no reason to make an argument for some purity of Imran Khan's politics. There are a lot of problems there. There is this underlying problem of the absence of any kind of critique of the military while he was in power, and other problems as well. But to say that he was some kind of an unpopular leader who was just installed by the military, or he just was a complete puppet of the military, um, and the same thing is now happening now, to make that kind of a complete proportional comparison, I think that is also intellectually dishonest. And I think the truth lies somewhere in between, that yes, he was popular, especially in KP, but in other places the military did help him and did help keep his coalition government together. But in many instances, he did not act like a puppet at all times. And that is the reason why the relations between them soured, and what happened after that. So just on that point of the Imran Khan's discourse in relation to the military, that also has evolved over time. So in 2009, 10, 11, he's on record, for example, in a speech he gave at the New York Historical Society, or I think the Asia Society, whatever that is called. He gave a speech in which he said that the military is not able to run the affairs of a country, and he really was very sarcastic towards them, that their training basically is on the battlefield and they can't handle problems of governance. He was always a very staunch and a very vocal critic of enforced disappearances of the Baloch people, of the Pathans in the tribal areas. He was one of the most vociferous critics of the US war on terror and drone attacks and the collateral damage as a result of that, and the kind of havoc that caused. So he was very good in terms of connecting the injustice of the Pakistani military elite with the injustice of the American empire. But from 2013 onwards, we do see a shift in his discourse, that he really began to temper that critique of the military and really mute that critique of the military for pragmatic reasons. And eventually that critique was completely muted while he was in power. And now in the last 3 years, that critique has come back in even much more intensified ways. So one hopes that, if he somehow does come back into power, that at least he will keep some of this, discourse and promise of really addressing the underlying root issue, which connects to all other issues, which is the injustice and the, frankly, the kind of brute terrorist violence of this intensely mediocre but nonetheless powerful military. So that is what one might hope for.
When the genocide in Gaza began, I vowed we would never let those responsible get away with this. Silence was complicity in a world that wants us to remain placid, a world that wants us to be concerned more about our immediate lives and interests. The system buys our souls in return for acquiescence with their empire-building project. We at the Thinking Muslim set about changing the narrative, and in the process, with Allah's barakah, we galvanize our communities to confront these political elites and send them a clear message. In elections on both sides of the Atlantic, we brought communities together and led the way in countering their pernicious agenda. Such is the power of this new media. Our mission is simple. We want to build an alternative Muslim media, one that is rooted in faith, thinking, and enlightened activism. And we need your help to expand this sacred undertaking. Our plan is to turn the Thinking Muslim into a multi-show, multi-country media project. Please help us by becoming a member. For as little as £10 a month, you will have access to bonus shows, behind-the-scenes content, and Q&A with me and my guests. But most importantly, your contributions will make this voluntary project go to the next level and give you a share, inshallah ta'ala, in this reward. Now, I know the demands on our sadaqah are great. Please do consider becoming a member of the Thinking Muslim, or send us your one-off donations by going to thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Jazakallah khair, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from all of us. So far, we've spoke about the civilian leaderships, and we've spoken about the army and the intensity of power that is located in the army leadership. But what about the landed gentry? Because of course, many a time it is said that voters vote according to voting blocks, and the landed gentry are in effect in charge of great swathes of people who vote according to the interests of those landed gentry, and many of them, of course, populate the political parties, and also I understand the PTI had a number of these landed gentry within them. Unlike India, after partition, 1952, I believe, there was the Zamindari Act, which enacted the abolition of large family landholdings. We haven't seen anything similar in Pakistan. And so, how much do you believe that the landed gentry and its influence over voting blocks is a major structural problem, I suppose, that Pakistan needs to deal with?
Absolutely, Jalal. That's an excellent question. And that, in some ways, is the underlying contradiction of the Pakistani nation and the nation state, which is that, on the one hand, especially the decade of the 1940s, especially right before the 1947 partition, one of the sort of rallying slogans for the creation of Pakistan was that this is a country which will transcend differences of ethnicity, class, landed elite versus non-elite, and will invest in this kind of an abstract but nonetheless very powerful idea of divine sovereignty. So this famous slogan that what is the meaning of Pakistan? There is no God but God. Pakistan ka matlab kya? La ilaha illallah. So this is the kind of discursive mobilization that Jinnah's Muslim League also drew on. But when it came to the actual elections that happened right before the partition, on that front, it really was these kinship-based solidarities and relationships, which were based on questions of land and landed elite and their relationship to their subjects. This contradiction has been most extensively talked about by the historian David Gilmartin in his book called, I think, Empire in Islam. It was on the Punjab, but precisely on this underlying contradiction of the Pakistani nation state, which has been there for a long time. So I think, and that also manifested in a moment such as the 2018 elections. So in Punjab especially, Imran Khan did rely in many constituencies on this landed elite who had their voter blocks. And I remember at that time, when he used to be asked that question of, why are you going with these landed elite and basically what they're called electables? And he used to say, well, they know better the science of elections, how to gather people on the day of the elections and get people from vans to the polling booth and so on. So that was again his pragmatic side. That but those are precisely the people who led to the sinking of his political ship, because they're the ones who jumped the ship in 2022. And then he later even acknowledged that that was a mistake that he made. So there is a cycle with Imran Khan of doing these kinds of things and then acknowledging his mistakes later on. But 2024, precisely why that is such an incredible election, is that this long-running pattern in Pakistani politics also, in some ways, came down in dramatic fashion. Here you had young people, in their 20s, early 30s, unknown people, many of them women, going up against these, really powerful landed elite who had these former electables, who had this, so-called voting, voters bank, and many of these, stalwarts of this landed elite lost really horrifically on election day. So that really is one of the most interesting moments where this long-running contradiction of the Pakistani nation state, which is still there, but we saw at least a glimpse of the political possibility of what can happen in the face of popular mobilization, popular sovereignty. So February 8th, 2024 is really a landmark moment in Pakistani politics and history for that reason, in that we really saw the possibility that this landed elite, always in collaboration, in cahoots with the military, keeps power, and we saw a popular mobilization that really broke some very important pillars of this power. The third thing that is important to note here, of course, the big elephant in the room, is that the most powerful and affluent and possessive landed elite in Pakistan is actually the Pakistani military, that actually owns most of the most important kind of prized land. So you have, for example, these cantonments in places like border cities like Quetta, where I'm from. Even in Karachi, you have these defense housing authorities, etc., which ultimately, of course, people buy, land and so on. But ultimately, these are military properties. You have the navy areas, and you have the, all kinds of different sort of cordoned off areas that the military has, and of course in Punjab, many of the protests that have happened in terms of the farmers trying to reclaim their land. Most recently, the current military chief Asim Munir, again a very intensely mediocre psychopath, went with the chief minister Mariam Nawaz. I think they were opening some kind of a green zone or something in the desert area, I believe of Cholistan, and in some ways without any kind of consideration for the local populace. So the underlying sort of usurpation of power and land by the military elite is one of the major kind of sources of injustice that is being perpetuated, for many decades. But what has changed, Jalal, I think in the last 2 years or so, and that in some ways is perhaps the most positive thing that has happened as a result of this brutality of the military, which is this: that this military had been engaging in these kinds of practices of torture, brutality, violence, suppression since the inception of Pakistan, mostly in border areas like Balochistan, the tribal areas, and against minorities of different sorts, mostly ethnic minorities, at times also religious minorities. But what has happened in the last 3 years is that there is almost a consensus in Pakistan at this point that these are the people who are the root of all problems, and these people are incredibly unjust, brutal terrorists. And it has to be said in this way, and this underlying secular assumption that when a non-state actor commits violence, that is terrorism, and when a state commits violence, that is not considered to be terrorism. We need to really question that underlying separation. There is a consensus on that front, and that consensus has emerged most dramatically in what used to be the stronghold of the military, which is the Punjab. Not only in larger cities like Lahore, but even in interior Punjab for that matter. So people who would really be the most die-hard kind of military supporters, and many of them, in fact, were also PTI supporters, to be fair. Their opinions have completely switched. I mean, the kinds of abuses I heard being hurled at the military in Lahore and in Punjab on this recent trip that I went for is quite unprecedented. And the reason for that is that Punjab went through the most brutal clampdown in relation to the PTI and Imran Khan. Of course, the military has been brutal and still is in Balochistan, the tribal areas. But in terms of its brutality and violence against PTI supporters, or those who might be suspected of being PTI supporters, was most dramatic in Punjab. And I'll just give you one small anecdote and close my answer on that. Most recently I was in Lahore, and the person who told me this anecdote especially told me that if you ever go on an interview or a podcast, tell my story. Don't say my name, but tell my story. So this was basically a local Uber driver, or Pakistan's version of Uber and so on. It's called InDrive. And this was a person in his early 30s, mid 30s, from the middle class. And he said that in May 2023, which is this quote unquote watershed moment as presented by the military, May 9th, 2023, that we should talk about in a moment as well. Where basically what happened was that there was a protest against the military. What was the nature of the protest? There are different versions of it, so I won't get into that right now and stick to the story of this person. In the military cantonments, or military sort of areas in Lahore and so on. And there was, as a result of that, a brutal clampdown, a brutal reaction by the military elite. So this person said that one night, in the middle of the night, the Punjab police comes, breaks his door, gets into his house, takes him, his wife, and his 1-year-old son, and takes them to the jail. And all night, his child was crying, and there was no food, no milk for this young kid. His diapers were wet. He was not given any kind of a change of diapers. And all night, the police basically urged him to admit that he was part of the May 9th protest, that he is a PTI supporter. And this guy said, I have nothing to do with the PTI. I was not even close to the area of the protest on that day. He was riding his, taxi somewhere else. And they just kept him in jail all night. And in the morning, they said, oh, sorry, we picked up the wrong guy. You can go back now at 11 a.m. And these are stories that you hear so frequently so repeatedly. And the extent of these stories is much more dramatic than what came out in the news or on social media even. And the reason for that is that how widespread this was. This was not some kind of a specific curtailed kind of military, campaign, which was of course run through the local police. But this was a really widespread campaign in which people were basically picked up at will. They had made a whole list of people who needs to be picked up, but then the police, in trying to make up the numbers on that list, picked up people at random. Oftentimes, kept them in jail for many nights. As part of their raids, they stole any cars or any of the valuables in the house from which they were picking up people. And if someone was affluent and they could give 4 or 5 lakh rupees, they would release them. And hence, of course, the middle class and the lower class was primarily the victim and the target of this military abuse. And because of that, although there has been this tremendous silencing through the threat of violence, but the opinion about the military has completely shifted. And that, I think, in the long run is a positive development, because if there is some kind of a consensus on this front, that might lead to the possibility of some kind of an alternate future. I mean, you were asking before we began the podcast of why Pakistan has not gone on the path of what happened in Bangladesh. So that might come up, but one of the reasons for that precisely is that the internal groups within Pakistan have been so fragmented. You have the Baloch, resistance in terms of the Pakistani military's sort of colonial attitude and violence in Balochistan. You have, of course, very strong Pathan resistance movements. Then you have the PTI. Then you have other movements that have, of course, been happening most recently in a place like Gilgit-Baltistan and Para-Chinar, of course. But these different movements of protest, I think, have not come together in any kind of an ideological or a coordinated fashion. And one reason for that also is that student unions have been banned in Pakistan for many decades, which is different from the case of Bangladesh. So because of these dynamics, people have not been able to coordinate some kind of a mass movement in the face of this brute violence and suppression. But hopefully there might be a possibility of making that happen. And that, I think, is the one sort of silver lining that we might take from this kind of brutality. When violence reaches a point that it becomes, incredibly banal, it begins to lose its effectiveness. But nonetheless, the situation is absolutely terrible, and people have gone into silence, and I would not blame them in that kind of face of that kind of brutal state violence. It makes sense to protect one's own dignity, one's own body, and one's own family.
Pakistan, as you said earlier, is full of contradictions. And one such contradiction, which I've always wondered about, is we see decisively since the 1960s and 70s and 80s, Pakistan has moved in an Islamic direction. There is an Islamization of society. When I went to Karachi, it was very clear to me that a large plurality of society have their sentiments within some form of Islamic framework and are very conscious of their relationship with Islam and their religion. However, that doesn't seem to translate into political expression. The Islamic political parties, Jamaat Islami in particular, do not do very well in national elections, and there's a sense that those political elites, the secular elites, still have a stranglehold over the cultural outputs on mass media. How do you account for this disparity between what seems to be mass society support and the power of these secular elites?
Well, a couple of things that need to be kept in mind in relation to that question. That's an excellent question, Jalal. One is that even someone like Ziaul Haq, who's sometimes seen as this, paragon of the Islamization of society, and who brought in all these policies that led to some kind of a public Islamization, he, in many ways, was also a very trusted ally of the US. And alongside this Islamization policy, he also is someone who basically was trained by the US military, who in fact even had fought against Palestinians before he became the military chief of Pakistan. So, one ought to be cautious of not equating some kind of a gesture toward Islamization with any expression of Muslim political agency and sovereignty. So he's very much a Westoxicated agent on that front when it comes to actual politics and questions of power. The second thing to keep in mind is that I think we perhaps need to think about the question of political power in ways that are not limited to who gets to sit in the government and run the nation state. So, you gave the example of Jamaat Islami, despite it not, of course, being in the majority or in terms of electoral performance, although that also has gone through its own kind of shifts. But maybe other parties may have more electoral representation in terms of elections, but they do wield tremendous street power. I mean, their protests oftentimes are perhaps the most coordinated, the most well organized, and the most massive. So when it comes to Palestine, this is the party which actually has done the most coordinated and intensive protests that became the object of state suppression as well. Similarly, of course, one can take the example of this new sort of religious and then political outfit, the TLP as they're called, Tehreek al-Labbaik, Pakistan. Their whole kind of agenda was about the protection of prophetic honor, but they also then got into the political sphere. So they may not win many seats, but they did come second in many constituencies in 2018, and then did recently well in 2024 as well. So I think one has to sort of realize that the expressions of popular will oftentimes are not fully reflected in who gets to win the elections, although that is, of course, the main tenet of liberal democracy, that popular will always be reflected in the parliament or these institutions of a parliamentary democracy, but that always is not the case. Similarly is the case of the ulama, the Pakistani traditionalist elite. So not many of the ulama, of course, are in the parliament, but someone like the famous Deobandi scholar Mufti Taqi Usmani wields tremendous authority and tremendous following among the public, and that, of course, can also be said about the Tablighi Jamaat and someone like Tariq Jamil and so on. So that's the second point I want to make. And on that front, precisely, I think the PTI is one of the most interesting case studies. Because here you have a party being run by a political leader who clearly is not from the religious elite by any means, does not have religious training, but nonetheless, among the foundations of his political agenda and discourse is the whole idea of following in the footsteps of the community of Medina in terms of socioeconomic justice, in terms of justice for the dispossessed and for minorities. So Imran Khan's underlying kind of sort of kernel of his political discourse while he was in power was that we need to aspire towards the community in the state of Medina. And it was a very interesting kind of case study of what we might call an Islamic modernism, where you had a political actor not trained traditionally in Islam, but still had some background in reading Shariati and Iqbal during his days at Oxford and later. So decently versed in Islamic knowledge traditions, oftentimes cites Rumi and Shah Waliullah and Ibn Khaldun as well, who basically made the argument that we need to bring together the socio-economic framework of the community of Medina with the welfare state model of Scandinavian countries. So in some ways what he did was he charted a kind of model of an Islamic welfare state that did not see its origins with modern Europe, but rather went all the way back to the community of Medina. So a notion of a certain kind of a welfare modernity that begins not with Europe, but goes all the way back to Medina. And one can, quarrel with some aspects of that as a student of Islam, but it's a very interesting kind of a political discourse that also has not been looked at with much seriousness by the detractors or, for that matter, supporters of Imran Khan. The second thing for Imran Khan, and the question of why is he this popular? I think begs some kind of reflection. Why is his popularity going through the roof, other than the detestation of the political elite in the military? And there, I think, again, your question is very relevant, because one of, I think, the reasons why he has the kind of support that he does, and one of the main reasons why he has the kind of visceral hostility that he espouses both within Pakistan and outside, is his underlying discourse, especially in the last 3 years, where he talked about this idea of what he calls true freedom, hakiki azadi, where the whole idea was that by investing one's submission to divine sovereignty, and this whole idea of one will only depend on the divine sovereign and not any other sovereign like the American state or the military elite and so on, that is where you derive your freedom. And that, of course, is drawing on Iqbal and a whole tradition of Islamic modernism that has played that kind of a move. But to make that kind of an argument in the kind of effective way that he does very often in terms of his discourse, and that expression of a Muslim sovereignty in the face of a country where you have a massive young population and large sorts of people who think, and I think very rightly so, that their decisions are not made by them but are made somewhere else. Now, that somewhere else could be the general headquarters of the military elite. It could be the landed elite, as you said. It could be the political elite of these dynastic, thugs, the PPP and the PMLNs. Or it could be, the mother of all violent elites, which is the American empire. So in that kind of a context, where people are yearning for some hint of sovereign expression, if you have a political leader who is employing this whole discourse of exercising your sovereign will, that is bound to have tremendous attraction. Now, of course, that might have tremendous, contradictions and tensions in terms of, Imran Khan's own politics. Does his politics actually match his discourse? But nonetheless, because discourse is also power, right? And power is always inherent in discourse. That, I think, is fundamental to any kind of analysis of the kind of power and popularity and attraction that Imran Khan yields at this point, ranging from within Pakistan, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in Punjab, really all over the country, to in Indian-occupied Kashmir, to the streets of Bradford, to London, to cab drivers in New York. When there are all these people who are supporting him, the explanation that this is some kind of a cult following. So that's the most kind of common reaction that you get, and even from some very serious academics whose intellectual work I admire, and some of my friends even. When it comes to Imran Khan, there is this incredible kind of paucity of some kind of measured, considered, critical, but measured, considered analysis of his popularity. And people really resort to these kinds of explanations that, oh, he used to be handsome when he was young and he has this following among, middle-aged women, and this is a cult following, and he basically is very good at showing people dreams. So that kind of an explanation, or the most sort of common trope that you find, the most intellectually hackneyed and problematic trope, that he is a populist like Trump or Putin, and here is the Pakistani populist. You just take one category and make this whole grand narrative around it, what I call the Pankaj Mishra methodology of looking at the world. So that does not account for this level of popularity and the kind of attraction. And I think for that, one has to look at his discourse carefully. I think one of the main reasons why so many caricatures of Imran Khan exist in Western media, The Guardian, BBC, New York Times, or even the local settings, there is two reasons. One is people don't follow his discourse carefully. If you actually listen to his speeches, his discourse, there is a contradictory but very interesting and fascinating kind of a political theology at work there. And the second reason is that people are just so incredibly biased and in many cases incredibly jealous of this person. And there is this kind of, I know you want to talk about the liberal elite also, but just as a hint I'll throw to end my already very long answer, which is in Imran Khan's case, there is also this kind of underlying, what I've called Imranophobia, which comes from a certain kind of a secular liberal elite in South Asia, Pakistan and India, where the idea is that he was one of us. He went to Oxford, had this really glamorous life and all these, female partners and so on, clean shaven. And he basically is now talking about the community of Medina, Hakiki Azadi, drawing on divine sovereignty and Rumi and Ibn Khaldun. He was supposed to be one of us. How dare he betray his own community? So he cannot be that easily dismissed as, some kind of a bearded, Muslim cleric that they can just call the mullah and just dismiss in that extent, by showing that kind of Islamophobia that many of these elites also have. So then they turn into these kinds of narratives of he's a Taliban Khan, where he basically argued that, drone attacks and violence as a result of drone attacks will only accentuate violence, not decrease it. And for that, he was basically called Taliban Khan or someone who is a religious fundamentalist or a populist. So these are very, very intellectually limited and dishonest kinds of analysis. And one does not have to be an admirer or romanticize him or glorifying him to do a little more of a measured discourse analysis. And that, I think, might be more intellectually and politically productive.
So let me then turn to the liberal elites. I mentioned in the earlier question that culturally, at least from when we think about mass media, the liberal elites, like in many countries, I suppose, they have a very strong stranglehold over the types of output that reaches society. I mean, how do you rate the earlier on in the conversation you spoke about Kemalism and the Kemalist class? Can you expand on that idea as well? I mean, do you see these liberals to be Kemalists in sort of the Turkish sense?
So in many cases, that is absolutely the case, and they do wield. One of the main counter arguments that people make when I or anyone might talk about these liberal elites or these liberal secular elites is that, oh, we don't have any power to begin with. The Pakistani public sphere is controlled by these religious fundamentalists. They're the ones who have all these protests and street power, and our space is already shrinking. And how dare you say that we're powerful? But these are the people who basically write opinion pieces in these liberal newspapers like Dawn in Pakistan or The Guardian and BBC. They're the ones who get all this funding from these think tanks in Washington, D.C., all this US aid. So at least on that front, I think one might have to agree with Trump. And this has been a massive business for many years, where you have this whole trope of women empowerment and trying to make Pakistan more progressive. So, for example, Jalal, after 9/11, there was this whole kind of discourse coming out of the Rand Corporation and the Heritage Foundation that the Taliban basically belong to the Deobandi branch of Islam, and hence they are the Puritans and the violent brand of South Asian Islam. And then you have these other scholars, their rivals called the Barelvis, and they're the soft Sufis, which is a complete caricature of the Barelvi school as well. And this is something I wrote about in my first book, Defending Mohammedan Modernity. But nonetheless, as a result of that, in Musharraf's era, this whole discourse of Sufi Islam as the moderate Islam, which has been there for many years in Pakistan, but this really became an object of tremendous state, expenditure of money and power. A lot of this money was coming from Washington, D.C., building of Sufi universities and so on, by presenting Sufism as some kind of a soft form of Islam. So there is very much a Kemalism at work here, where the underlying idea is that progress only happens once you moderate, regulate, and control this thing called religion and religious practice and expression and Islam, that if you don't regulate it, if you don't moderate it, it will spill over into violence. And Musharraf basically used that whole kind of anxiety of the US empire at that time about quote-unquote religious fundamentalism and Islamic quote-unquote terrorism to advance his whole brand of Kemalism, which had been there for many years, but he really gave it a new life. But on that front, many people who might call themselves anti-Musharraf, anti-military, but on that front, that underlying Kemalism still exists. So there are many people in Pakistan, in the academy, in these think tanks and the government and so on, bureaucracy. Some of them are Westoxicated, other wannabe Westoxifieds, who, for example, are very critical of the military, but they were, all for the drone attacks by saying, no, it actually kills these religious fundamentalists. I remember at an academic conference in the US, a major, a Pakistani academic standing up at the Q&A session saying that, but ultimately, drone attacks are quite accurate, and mostly the people who we hear about who were killed were terrorists. So, of course, there's some kind of, human error that might happen. So that's the level of violence these people have in terms of the religious threat. Now, that is not to undermine the violence that some of the religious clerics and the elite have also committed, and this is not some kind of giving a free pass to the religious elite and the religious sector either. But this underlying Kemalism oftentimes does get this kind of state sanction, and in the current moment, that is something which is really at work at the foremost, where you have this mixture of Kemalism, toxic dynastic thuggery in the form of PMLN and the PPP party. And in terms of Kemalism, it is really this particular political party. The PMLN also has made tremendous strides in trying to be proper Kemalists. But it is really the Pakistan People's Party, the Bhutto's party, that has been at the forefront of going to Washington, D.C., trying to present themselves as the good liberals, the good Muslims, the progressives, who can really bring about some kind of a progressive change in Pakistan through the discourse of women's emancipation and so on, while at the same time brutally clamping down on opponents in their own province that they have ruled over for the last 2 decades. In terms of infrastructure, the most rundown major city in Pakistan right now, Karachi, and really an incredibly incompetent, incredibly corrupt dynastic thugs. But they play that game quite well of presenting themselves as the good progressives within the Pakistani society. The one kind of qualifier I want to make, so as not to be misinterpreted, that I think we do need to make a distinction between what we might call this liberal secular elite, driven very much by this kind of unvarnished Kamalism, and a certain what we might call, a left, an intellectual left, and also an activist left that might be very critical of Imran Khan for different reasons. And on some counts, I do not agree with the extent or the vociferousness of their critique. And I think at times they also perhaps caricature Imran Khan in ways, but that is a disagreement. But one has to acknowledge that there are what we might call a more principled left that has been critical of the military in a principled fashion. And many of them, in fact, were very vigorous critics of Pakistan. In some cases, people who were actually mistreated during Imran Khan's government by the military elite in terms of being jailed for, sedition or critiquing the military on Twitter and so on. And Imran Khan did not do much to help them, although in some cases he is said to have, gotten people released and so on. But very critical of Imran Khan, who went through a lot of problems during his government, but still have taken the principled stance of being critical and very publicly so against the current military dispensation. So we do need to make a distinction between a liberal secular elite and a certainly more principled left in the academy, in the activist circles and so on. Though many, even among the latter, I think for the year or so after Imran Khan's removal, were embroiled in this whole debate. Is Imran Khan really properly anti-colonial? Is he really properly revolutionary? Is this really unprecedented? Who were really going in a very childish fashion, writing emails or getting, endorsements from poor Noam Chomsky, who used to get emails from these leftists saying that, no, Imran Khan is not really radical. And then Imran Khan supporters writing to him saying, no, he really is much more radical than these people are presenting him to be. It's quite bizarre kind of ideological battles that happen in Pakistan. So I think that was a very unhelpful kind of discourse. Is this unprecedented? Is he really a good revolutionary or not? Where people were literally being brutally killed and jailed and suppressed with incredible power. So what if it was unprecedented or not? Though in the urban centers, I would say this is unprecedented, especially in relation to the urban centers. But yeah, so that I think is some kind of a brief map of what we might call sort of kind of a liberal secular elite, but then a much more principled and in many cases a very academically sophisticated left that many of whose work I admire and also follow.
SherAli, any conversation about Pakistan would be insufficient without a discussion on the role of China and China's relationship with the country. Now, of course, China has a very strong trading relationship, and some would suggest that when it comes to the Belt and Road project, Pakistan is China's most important ally in expanding its maritime and trade routes across not just the region, but of course as a gateway to the Indian Ocean and Europe and beyond. So Pakistan plays a very important role in this Chinese bid to become at least a world trading power, if not a world political military power. And of course, you're in the States, and the American, in particular the Trump administration, is very worried about China's rise. And you hear often from both Democrats and Republicans that Pakistan is in danger of becoming a vassal of the Chinese state through debt diplomacy and its disproportionate trading relationship with Pakistan. What's the truth of that relationship dynamic between Pakistan and China?
So, Jalal, I'm not an economist, but what I've seen from experts, it's clear that for a long time, but especially the last 10 years or so, the indebtedness of the Pakistan's economy and the kind of financial crisis that Pakistan has been going through, which again has been really, really brutal for especially the middle class, but at this point even the upper middle class, let alone the impoverished, the lower classes. That in many ways the relationship to any of these foreign entities, powerful foreign entities, has been one of trying to get some kind of help or some kind of financial boost from wherever they might get it. On this particular question, of course, when Biden was in power, there was, I think, a certain kind of a tilt towards the US. That also was seen in this regime change operation against Imran Khan. Not any kind of open hostility towards China, but there is very much a kind of tilt that Qamar Javed Bajwa, the previous military chief, I think, thought that by tilting more towards the US, more kind of traditional, Pakistan's ally, this, superpower, when it comes to the whole Russia-US situation and this kind of US-China relationship. So that is where the loyalties should lie. But now that Biden is out of power, I think it remains to be seen how that will be reconfigured. But one of the major kind of challenges that the Pakistani state has faced is that precisely this question of the non-transparency of these contracts and the whole, the terms of this Belt and Road Initiative. In some ways, that also was seen during Imran Khan's government. There was some sort of percolations of the idea that this needs to be made more transparent. But at the same time, Imran Khan in a very praising way, talked about the way China has taken its population out of poverty. Then he clearly saw China as a major role model for that, and he was all praised for China on many fronts. And clearly, his relationship with the US was much more tense and cold for various reasons, especially his discourse on the war on terror and the question of American imperialism, more broadly speaking. So it remains to be seen how these configurations will play out. But the relationship is marked by a complete imbalance of power when it comes to China, when it comes to the US, or when it comes to the Gulf states and the UAE, in that whoever might provide any kind of economic aid, that's where I think the loyalties will shift. I don't think there is much kind of an ideological discourse or calculations being played here in terms of what does Pakistan stand for, what should an Islamic welfare or republic ally oneself. I think this is just primary, primal needs of sustaining the country and keeping this military dispensation going through help that they might get from anywhere. And I don't think there's any kind of a principled stance or position that is being taken on that front.
One final question for you, SherAli, and it's really been a fascinating conversation. I want to end with maybe a more hopeful note, hopefully a hopeful note, and that is the potential of Pakistan and its ability to rejuvenate, despite all of the very many challenges that the country faces. I mean, I visited Karachi not so long ago, and I fell in love with the country. I'm not actually originally from Pakistan, but I fell in love with the country, and actually, I would imagine if Pakistan became a state that was stable, very many good minds from across the West who have left Pakistan, second, third generation Pakistanis, would return back to that country to rebuild it. But for whatever reason, Pakistan remains stubbornly this country that attracts a lot of dissension, I suppose, or a lot of disagreement or dislike, even, or distaste amongst Pakistanis who live abroad, in terms of a place for where they can live their lives out. So what is the potential of Pakistan? And I suppose the secondary question is, how do we get there? Like, how do we support Pakistan to reach that potential?
That's a great question, Jalal. A couple of things I would say in response to your question. The first thing I would say is, I will talk about hope in a moment, but I also do want to use the opportunity of this question to make the point that, one ought not to sort of artificially manufacture hope, but I do want to also reflect on just the degree of hopelessness and the dire situation that the country is in terms of its financial situation, in terms of the kind of incredible inflation that we saw. I mean, I've heard stories of people, oftentimes it is, the drivers that you get the most interesting stories from. So my hotel shuttle that was taking me back to the airport in Lahore, the driver saying that, literally he did not have the means to even get his son circumcised, and that he had to delay that because he did not have the 5,000 or 10,000 rupees to do that. So, incredibly dire situation. It's complete political suppression and brutality. You have dozens of political workers imprisoned and being tortured on a daily basis, in the mainland and of course in the peripheries. enforced disappearances, and the military's killing and violence continues on a daily basis. And really, I will have to say that I have never experienced the degree of a certain kind of melancholia among the Pakistani public, especially the younger generation, than what I saw most recently in different places, Karachi, Lahore, etc. And on that front, I should also say that problems have always existed, and of course, as I said, that if Imran Khan had not been removed from power, most likely he would have lost the elections the next year. But things really were not this bad, and one needs to make that kind of distinction. In that, for all of critiques that we might make of Imran and his problems of his policies or capacity or the people he was working with, there are some really admiring things that also happened during his rule, such as, for example, his discourse during the very tense Pulwama episode in 2019, when India and Pakistan almost went to war, and the speeches he gave there and the kind of statesmanship he showed, and showed that when nation states go into this kind of a violent spree, what are the consequences of that, and showing his underlying pacifist commitments. During COVID-19, when you had all kinds of people, even these sophisticated academics saying lockdown, lockdown, that's a way to do things, right? Because that is what the US is doing. I think it's remarkable that Imran Khan really was one of the few political leaders globally who had the underlying kind of common sense and this underlying instinctive kind of reaction that no, in this context, lockdowns will be absolutely horrific for the lower class and so on, and that became more of a an agreed upon point by the scientist community much later. So on that front, many people who voted for Imran Khan, people that I'm in touch with, that I speak with in places like Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the KP province, the reason why they support Imran Khan is not so much about, that he was at once allied with the military or even his nationalism for that matter. Many of them, the most common response I get is the health cards that he issued during this time, where people were able to use these health cards as an insurance. Now, there are some criticisms of that health card system as well, but some kind of gesture towards catering for the dispossessed, towards some kind of, even in discourse, of thinking about a welfare state that caters for the dispossessed, for whatever contradictions and tensions might be there in that position, but there was some gesture towards that. Or this whole billion tree tsunami campaign, which might have again some problems, and I know from my environmentalist friends that it had some kind of neoliberal issues, but still at least this gesture of caring for the environment as a theological commitment, and his underlying push against corruption, I think, despite the contradiction that many corrupt people also have entered his party, I think that underlying discourse has been tremendous for Pakistan. I think he really, is the one political figure who turned this underlying idea of corruption in a developing country like Pakistan into a theological problem, into a problem that really was of theology and the question of justice in Islam. So I do want to make this contrast between what things are like now and what they were even in the recent past. But the hopeful kind of note, and this I think is not a manufactured hope, but something that I think is a potential. I think the potential really is, this is really a right moment where you have people across ideological divisions who can come together on at least this underlying commitment of showing resistance and critiquing in different ways, in whatever possible ways, the military elite and the military sort of terrorist factory. And in addition to that, making the case that they will also not tolerate American imperial interventions and dictations when it comes to Pakistani society. And that kind of possibility of alliances across ideological divides, I think, is possible. It's difficult, but it is possible in the current moment. So, one of the most heartening stories that I heard in the last year is, again, from a student at this major university in Pakistan, in Islamabad, the capital, called Qaid-e-Azam University, where I heard about this narrative whereby you had the student who was a PTI supporter. This is around 2023, when the military brutality was really at its, well, it still is at its peak, but was really high. And the student was talking to a Baloch student, a friend of his. And and they were talking and they were, sort of chatting with each other. So the person who told me the story went up to the PTI, supporting a young student, and said, "How come you've become friends with this Baloch student? You used to be very critical of him, and you used to say that they are, anti-state, and used to say that they are, causing propaganda against the military. How come you became friends?" And the PTI supporting student said that, I was wrong. And now I have realized, and I have apologized to him, that I was wrong all along about the military, about its violence. And that, I think, was a really beautiful kind of moment where you had the possibility of this alliance. And I think that alliance needs to be further cultivated, not by resorting to these kind of sarcastic jabs at PTI supporters that, oh, look, these military loving people have finally woken up. And that also is a caricature. Not all PTI supporters were military loving to begin with, especially in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. Imran Khan's popularity is much more complicated, as I've tried to argue here. But that kind of an alliance between, I think, the principled left, which has done some incredible work when it comes to social justice, when it comes to, speaking up for the labor class, alliances between them, and then this middle class, which really is one of the major sources of the popularity and the following of Imran Khan. Alliances between ethnic divides, so the Baloch resistance with the Pathan movements that have been ongoing for a while, like this famous Pathan movement called the PTM, what is called the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, or protecting Pashtun interests movement, and more sort of PTI leading Pathans. So there is, I think, a possibility of some kind of ideological alliances that might then provide a more unified front to the military. And it might be a long game. It's not something that can happen instantly. It's some kind of a model that you just come out in the streets and cause some kind of a revolution overnight, although that might happen. It might be instigated at a point as well. But I think that is the need of the hour, to come together on this underlying two-point agenda: a critique of the military and a complete intolerance of the political intervention of the military and its violence, and complete intolerance of any kind of intervention by the American empire. I think that is a hopeful possibility that might be possible, and for that, I think what people like you, Jalal, can do, or those people who are in the diaspora who perhaps have more, of a capacity to speak up in more explicit ways. Although in many cases, even people who are related to diaspora, people have been picked up and tortured who might have spoken up in the West and elsewhere. But what we really can do, and what you can do, especially in the media, is precisely to try to interrogate Pakistani politics and society beyond caricatured headlines, beyond these kinds of headlines of the Muslim fundamentalist state that is at the brink of disaster, or the failed nuclear armed state, or these underlying Orientalist, Islamophobic, pathological kind of caricatures. All these caricatures that Imran Khan, the one-time blue-eyed boy of the military, has now gone against it, which is perpetuated even by the BBC. I mean, even something like Democracy Now!, this underlying die-hard object of love for all the liberals and the leftists all over, and maybe in Palestine they were good. But when it came to Pakistan, Jalal, right after 2022, when all this, when Imran Khan was removed from power, they literally aired segments where they tried to argue that these people, these dynastic thugs, Maryam Nawaz, the daughter of Nawaz Sharif, and Bilawal Bhutto, the son of Benazir Bhutto and Asif Zardari, Zardari being perhaps the most corrupt of all of these thugs, that they were some champions of democracy. And the reason why they said that is because they basically brought in these liberal secular elites to their programs. They became the informants, the Pakistani informants, and that's the kind of story they went with. So I think we really need to listen to the voices of the people as much as possible. Why is that taxi driver in Dubai, in Bradford, in London, New York, Lahore, Karachi so attracted to Imran Khan? Trying to think about that beyond these kinds of caricatured, hackneyed categories like cult following and hero worship and so on. And in some cases that might be true, but I think we need a more sophisticated analysis. We need to go beyond the headlines and caricatured representations, and that can only be done through these kinds of conversations that go into some depth, where people might disagree. That many people might disagree with many things I've said, but that disagreement should not resort to some kind of visceral reactions of, oh, this is horrible, horrible terms that people use for PTI supporters. Some of the most champions of feminism, for example, talk about PTI supporters as this word called youthia, which is basically rhyming for the word cunt in Urdu. So, I mean, that is the kind of level of discourse that people resort to rather than a considered and measured debate, disagreement, and conversation. So, those kinds of conversations are needed. And I think your platform and other platforms, if there were more, outlets like the Thinking Muslim in mainstream media, I mean, the Middle East Eye, I think, plays a good role on that front. But we need more of this coverage. That is not about pro or anti Imran Khan, but that interrogates these issues beyond the headlines, which are oftentimes violent, secular headlines that dominate Western and in many cases South Asian media as well.
Professor SherAli Tereen, I think that's been really a fascinating conversation, and we need to bring you back on to discuss Pakistan's relationship with India in particular at some point, because I think that requires probably a separate conversation, and Kashmir, of course. But Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Allah. Really been an honor. Assalamu alaikum. And Ramadan Mubarak to everyone.
Ramadan Mubarak. When the genocide in Gaza began, I vowed we would never let those responsible get away with this. Silence was complicity in a world that wants us to remain placid, a world that wants us to be concerned more about our immediate lives and interests. The system buys our souls in return for acquiescence with their empire-building project. We at the Thinking Muslim set about changing the narrative, and in the process, with Allah's barakah, we galvanize our communities to confront these political elites and send them a clear message. In elections on both sides of the Atlantic, we brought communities together and led the way in countering their pernicious agenda. Such is the power of this new media. Our mission is simple. We want to build an alternative Muslim media, one that is rooted in faith, thinking, and enlightened activism. And we need your help to expand this sacred undertaking. Our plan is to turn the Thinking Muslim into a multi-show, multi-country media project. Please help us by becoming a member. For as little as £10 a month, you will have access to bonus shows, behind-the-scenes content, and Q&A with me and my guests. But most importantly, your contributions will make this voluntary project go to the next level and give you a share, inshallah ta'ala, in this reward. Now, I know the demands on our sadaqah are great. Please do consider becoming a member of the Thinking Muslim, or send us your one-off donations by going to thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Jazakallah khair, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from all of us. Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.